economy in the U.S. is looking more robust, and the Fed is trying to figure out when the right moment will be to start raising rates. Of course, this is an extremely difficult process. Raising rates too late might require the Fed to act aggressively, but raising rates too early might push us back into a recession. Never good. Now, to get a better handle on some of these issues, I spoke earlier to Frances Coppola, an expert in banking and financial risk management. She shares her thoughts on banking, finance, and economics at the blog CoppolaComments.com. Now, before we discussed monetary policy, I first wanted to get her perspective on financial warfare and sanctions. I asked her if she could explain how sanctions constitute financial warfare. Here's what she had to say.
Well, these days, the financial system is immensely important, not only to banks and to ordinary people and so forth, but also to governments. So one of the ways of, I guess, expressing our displeasure that stops short of blowing people up is actually to make it very difficult for them to use their financial system. And that's pretty much what I mean by sanctions as financial warfare.
So, you know, from reading I take away that you felt then that the U.S. had already prepared the ground for more extensive attacks on Russia's fragile economy. So where do you see the sanctions issue heading, and what kind of economic impact do you think that will have?
Well, I think the US is probably going to do more sanctions, and I think they will be financial ones, basically because they are very effective. I mean, you only have to look at what happened, even just with these, what they've done so far, which is minimal, really. The ruble fell, the MySex fell. That doesn't sound too terrible until you realise that the currency falling and the stock market falling has knock-on effects into the real economy. It causes problems with the price of goods. It has effects on people. And it sounds terrible to say this, but actually one of the purposes of sanctions is to impact ordinary people in the hopes that there will be some feedback to the government about changing their ways, really.
Do you see any knock-on effects in the European Union?
Oh, yes. Germany particularly, and Italy and France do have extensive trading links with Russia, so does Eastern Europe. Sanctions will affect the ability of countries and companies in the European Union to transact with Russia. There's no doubt about that, and therefore we could expect that there would be an impact on the European economy as well. It will affect those countries in particular, and the Eurozone and Europe as a whole, I think.
Now, according to central banks, the global economy is still fragile, and this is why they're keeping rates at record lows right now. But given central banks' reaction function in past economic cycles, do we run the risk of responding too late?
We do. I wrote about this recently. I looked at the FOMC minutes going back to 1954 and discovered that in every recession they had raised rates too late and then too much. After each recession. So we are running the risk of leaving it too late and then panicking and raising them too much. And that's because monetary policy takes time to feed into real economic effects. But the FOMC and the central banks in other countries are having to make decisions on a month-by-month basis based upon backward-looking indicators. So quite often they're making decisions about what's going to happen going forward and what effect their monetary policy is having based upon what's just happened, which may be nothing because they only did it last month. It's quite a problem, actually trying to judge when to raise rates and by how much.
Now, when central banks begin raising rates, they usually continue to do so. So is it possible that raising rates too late means having to be more aggressive, since the mere act of starting to employ this rate hike regime increases credit demand, as it's a signal to borrowers to lock in their rates now?
Yeah, there is a risk, and in fact, again, we've tended to see that in the past, that when they have started to raise rates, they've often raised them quite a lot, quite quickly, which has quite aggressive effects on the economy. To be fair, the last time we went into a tightening cycle, which was in 2004, they didn't do that. They raised them very, very gradually over a period of about 2 years. The problem was they raised them a bit too much and then held them too high. But they did actually raise them very gradually. So, and the effect on the economy was gentler. I mean, if you go back to 1994, where they raised them very fast, there was a huge spike in bond yields, and nobody really wants a repeat of that.
What do you make of rule-based approaches to monetary policy, like the Taylor rule?
Yes, this is the live one at the moment, isn't it? I think economic rules like that are a useful basis upon which economists can make judgments about where they think the economy is going and what they should be doing. But I wouldn't like to see a particular rule rigidly locked in as a you must obey this rule at all times. I think if we had obeyed what the Taylor rule said in 2008, we might be in a much worse shape now than we are. So I wouldn't like to see a position where FOMC members and other central bank policymakers can't make their own judgments based upon their own information.
Francis, why should we rely on monetary policy as a way to steer the economy at all, since its only impact on the real economy is through interest, credit, and financial asset channels?
This is interesting. Some people think you should only use monetary policy, and some people think that you should combine it with fiscal policy. My own view is that monetary policy has limitations, and a lot of people have said that it has difficulty gaining traction at the zero lower bound because we can't knock rates down anymore very easily. But I also think it has quite serious distributional problems. We've seen that with QE, where it's really just raised asset prices for the rich. There is a trickle-down effect to the real economy, but it's perhaps nowhere near as effective as a fiscal stimulus would have been, as indeed we had in 2009. So myself, I don't think monetary policy should be the only thing we use. I think we need partnership between monetary and fiscal, and macroprudential these days as well, given that we have a wobbly banking system.
Given how much asset prices, like London property prices, have risen in this economic cycle, are you at all worried about household debt?
I'm always worried about household debt. It varies from country to country. I'm in the UK, where I think household debt is a huge problem. It's something like 140% of GDP. And that's existing debt, and yet our house prices haven't fallen in the way that they did in the US. And we're trying to encourage people to borrow more to be able to afford houses. I think it's a huge worry. I think we have to find some way of enabling people to get their balance sheets under control. For me, the way to do that actually is perhaps some kind of debt forgiveness, and I know that people have talked about this, but more importantly in the UK is to get people's incomes up. We've had 6 years of stagnating wages and falling real incomes. That's a real risk with indebted households, is that their debts just become unaffordable after a while.
That was Francis Coppola, founding editor of CoppolaComment.com.